So, cherubs, if you've been watching my videos for the past few months, you know that I made a video about how W.H. Auden felt that poetry, and implicitly art itself, does nothing in the world. I then made a video about Arthur Danto's argument that art is a form of philosophy that does something extremely important. It helps us ask and attempt big answers to questions about the nature of reality, questions about consciousness, knowledge, the foundations of ethics, and so on. That it's philosophy. It gives birth to new concepts and ways of indexing the world so that we can engage with it and others in more meaningful ways. But since then, I've been thinking, okay, so art is a form of philosophy, but what does philosophy actually do? Like, why is that powerful? It still seems like art and the art world occupy a pretty abstract and questionably important role in the world. But then I read a book about the Chicago-based artist Theaster Gates. Then I read the many reviews that he has in the New York Times, the New Yorker. I read some reviews in Art News. I watched his TED Talk, and I read a bunch of interviews. And then I got my answer. I think I understand now what art can do. The answer is quite long, but in short, art can transform a city by transforming the material reality of the city alongside the way that we think about the city. Part of this answer is going to ask us to think about the words art and artist in a more capacious way than we usually do. The words will need to include everything from painting to pottery to architecture and city planning. So this video is going to be a deep dive into the artwork of Theaster Gates and an investigation into the real-world consequences of a poetic imagination. And if looking into the work of artists who engage with big ideas seems like your type of thing, then please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon. So let's just jump right into his artwork. Theaster Gates often works in the ready-made genre of art. You may already know about this kind of art from the famous ready-mades by Marcel Duchamp. He would take everyday items and recontextualize them in a museum or gallery, and viewing the items in those spaces forces the viewer to think about the aesthetics of those objects in new ways. The context of the gallery changes our visual habits. When a urinal appears on a podium, it inspires conversations that wouldn't happen in a bathroom. Conversations about the formal aspects of the sculpture, sure, but also about those visual habits themselves, about how the way that we interpret or understand the purpose of material objects in the world changes depending on the context that those objects appear in, or the way that our understanding and relationship with the object does not depend entirely on the object itself, but the situation that the objects appear within. Ready-mades explore these contingencies in the subject-object relationship. The work of Theaster Gates participates in these conversations. He has, for example, famously taken decommissioned fire hoses and put them in gallery spaces in different arrangements. He calls these Civil Rights Tapestries. These hoses can no longer serve their original purpose, which was to carry high volumes of water from point A to point B. They become obsolete in their original subject-object purpose. That required them to serve a specific purpose. So now they're just garbage because they can't do that. They're things rather than objects because we as subjects don't have a relationship with them anymore. They don't have a purpose, but through a reorganization and repurposing of the material, Gates positions the viewer to consider them anew. When they're framed like this, arranged like a tapestry or a painting and put in a gallery space, we can then apply the language of aesthetics or philosophy or history to these materials that perhaps have never received that kind of attention. And when we do, we might consider the way that the stripes created by these hoses resembles an American flag, kind of. And then we might think about the role that those fire hoses played in disrupting protests during the Civil Rights era. So these previously worthless materials all of a sudden become political or historical and evoke that kind of thinking. And it doesn't stop there. When those aesthetic, philosophical, or historical interpretive frameworks activate in us, we might also think about how the symbol of water, which is typically used as a symbol for rebirth or baptism, has been used as a weapon in American history. We might think about how hoses like these have been used to save lives and oppress lives, and what it might mean for them to be framed and memorialized in this way with the title American Tapestry. So that's one way in which the work of Theaster Gates operates in the world. He transforms or reimagines materials that have been deemed to no longer have value, and he reinvests them with artistic purpose. But it's actually more than that. When he takes something commonly understood to be worthless and finds a way to make it meaningful, he's forcing us to recognize that maybe we need to reconsider our own visual habits and our relationship with the objects around us. Maybe that thing had value all along and we just failed to see it because we've been conditioned to overlook it. Work by Theaster Gates asks us to reevaluate our way of seeing the material world. Okay, so Theaster Gates participates in this ongoing referendum about how we see the world. Now let's apply those concepts to his biggest project, the Stony Island Arts Bank. In the Stony Island Arts Bank, Theaster Gates purchased an abandoned building, a bank, that was sitting in about 6 feet of standing water and which had been marked for demolition. A building that no one would pay to renovate because developers understood the structure would not be worth the investment. Everybody agreed that this building, a bank, no longer had any value, which, right away, particularly in retrospect, it's easy to see the artistic potential there. A bank, a monument to money and capital value, a place filled with bankers, the arbiters of value, the people who decide how much a loan is worth or which particular investments have the potential to generate even more value. That building has been deemed worthless, as having no value. So Theaster Gates bought it for $1 from the mayor of Chicago and made himself responsible for an expensive renovation. Once purchased, he began the work of reimagining the materials of the space. He took marble petitions from between urinals and engraved them with the words, "In art we trust." He made them look like savings bonds, but with repurposed marble. He then took 100 of these bonds to Art Basel and sold them for $5,000 each. That money could then be reinvested into the building. It could fund further artistic projects that then could be sold at other art fairs, and we can continue that process. So, by reinvesting useless material with renewed purpose, he's able to generate value. Imagination and some acid etching created both cultural and artistic value and monetary value. And then he reinvested that value into the building perceived as useless. It's a giant cycle of imagination, revaluation, and reinvestment. It's all very clever. And once he actually renovated the bank, he transformed it into a cultural center, a place for art installations, a platform for more of the world to be reimagined and created. But it's more than that. It's also an archive. Banks keep the valuable stuff safe, and this bank is no different. The Stony Island Arts Bank holds every print run of the Johnson Publishing House, a publishing house that went out of business, a publishing house that lost its value. So all the editions of Ebony and Jet magazines have been leather-bound and given new purpose as an archive of Black culture and publishing inside this bank. This bank, that once held money, now exists as a place of cultural value. It also provides loans to artists, but it understands that capital is only an expression of value. A bank, this seems to say, can hold and protect diverse forms of value. And the original building itself was designed in that classical, monumental style of banks and government buildings that's typical in the United States. It looks like a place of reverence. It's a style that tells those who enter it to respect that which goes on inside. Our banks are temples to money, but this bank has been recontextualized as a sacred space to respect Black performance, Black history, and the stories of Chicago. So to put all these pieces together, Theaster Gates took a decrepit bank in a neighborhood that nobody wanted to invest in, and then he used the money of those art collectors attending Art Basel, along with the money of others who were willing to buy artwork made from worthless materials in the abandoned bank, to invest in his neighborhood within his city. He reorganized the way that we think about value, and he transformed something as big as an abandoned bank into a place of human connection and a historical archive that can now connect us to the past. And he was able to do this because that's what art does. Art, among other things, investigates how meaning is made, how value is understood, how a few dollars worth of paint can be arranged on a canvas and be transformed into something that produces emotion, inspires conversation, and connects people to the world and to each other through symbols. And Theaster Gates has called this whole idea leveraging. He's called it a hustle. So let's just investigate that idea for a second. Under capitalism, money is a signifier of success. If you make something and people like it or find it useful, then they will pay you money for it. So money becomes a way to measure success, similar to the way that standardized test scores in secondary education measure success, or views on a YouTube video measure success. It's a metric. And I think it's easy to understand that a metric is always just a proxy for success and not actually success itself. It's a way to measure success, like standardized test scores are a proxy for learning in schools. We try to measure how much learning happened by looking at the test scores. But it's really easy to imagine how somebody might earn a high score but not have learned anything. It happens all the time. Views on YouTube are a way to measure whether or not people liked the video that you've made. But you can also get those views because people hate the video or they enjoy making fun of you, which is probably not the type of success that you want. The metrics that we use as proxies for success do not always align with the ways that we define success. We don't actually want high test scores or views. We want students to learn. We want people to enjoy the video that we've made. We want to be perceived as smart and cool. And sometimes we confuse the metric for success for the substance of success. We pursue money, test scores, and views as though they're the thing that we want. When developers looked at the abandoned bank, they thought about it with the language of capital and investment. They wanted to make money with the building the same way that I want high test scores for my students or views on these videos. They mistook money, a proxy for success, as the end goal. But the metric is not actually the goal. They're high test scores without the learning. When Theaster Gates looked at the abandoned bank, he thought about it with the language of resurrection, transformation, and creation. He wanted to make something that connects and inspires people, something that would attract human attention. So when everybody else pursued high test scores, Gates pursued learning. He understood that the value comes from the act of creation. Gates has said that the art world is a hustle. Understanding his goals and how he defined value and success for his project, he could acquire a metric of success, money, by pursuing meaningful goals, like connecting people with each other and their shared history, helping a community find joy through aesthetic experiences, learning, engaging and collaborating in meaningful labor with good people, participating as a member of a supportive community, and all the other stuff that we actually want out of life. If we keep goals like that in mind, then we can look for other ways to measure our success in pursuit of those goals. Money is only one proxy. It's only one metric. Like when two or more people work together and engage in meaningful labor, something is created. We can value that. We can measure our success with the artifacts that we create together. So Gates worked with people to make those saving bonds out of the abandoned marble building. He engaged in meaningful labor with creative people and made something. He created a symbol, because that's what artists do. They operate in the space between the material world and the symbolic world. Then he sold those bonds, those symbols, for money. So in short, understanding that value comes from the creative act, he manipulates art buyers who operate in a system that thinks that value comes from the metric of value. He used the artist's understanding of symbols to fund the production of more art. But, to be honest, I'm not quite happy with the way I've just tried to explain this. The way that I've just phrased everything, saying that he manipulates a system, it sounds a bit cynical. I don't mean to say that the savings bonds are merely symbolic or that the world of signifiers and symbols has no real value, that it's just something to be manipulated or leveraged, because that's not it at all. Understanding how the symbolic significance of something works does not negate the importance or necessity of the symbol. We're always going to live in a world of symbolic meaning. There's always going to be a gap between the signifier and the signified, and understanding those relationships does not make them less meaningful. Objects exist in the material world, and we project meaning and purpose onto them. Theaster Gates helps me understand the necessity of being thoughtful with the way that we create these symbols. The ready-mades of Theaster Gates are different than the ready-mades of Marcel Duchamp, because the materials and the history behind Gates's material carries significance themselves. Those savings bonds carry value because they came from a building deemed to have no value. They remind us of our power to transform the material world with our labor and our ability to transform the stories that we tell about the material world with our attention and imagination. The imagination and the creative act of symbol production, that matters. In an interview with Carol Becker, Theaster Gates said that there's a way in which artists might have the power to conjure the symbolic, to do things in the world that other folks couldn't imagine. And it's this power to conjure the symbolic that I want to stress. When I consider the work of Theaster Gates, the importance of both the symbolic and the material becomes clear. His art is not just the philosophy of meaning-making and symbols. It's about how those symbols can be used, or as he says, leveraged, to create the connections and communities that we actually need. He makes this point even more clear during that same interview when he talks about paintings he's done with tar in collaboration with his father, who was a roofer. Describing those paintings, he says that the objects are just the things that allow me to continue the relationship with my dad. It's not to say that I don't care about the tar painting, but the tar painting gave us a reason to relate. Tar has a symbolic meaning for him, and the tar doesn't become less meaningful by calling out that symbolic nature. Instead, it lets him use the way that this symbol works to help him relate to his father. Tar is a medium that his father knows well. By working with tar alongside his father, the connection between them is reinforced. The painting then becomes a symbolic deposit of that relationship. So material objects like tar and the tar paintings help mediate these deeper connections. And that's what art does. It helps us understand how the material structures we live with and within give shape to our relationships and our values. The artwork of Theaster Gates shows us how art and philosophy can transform the material world. A fire hose, a bank, a neighborhood, and in doing so, transform the relationships and communities that come in contact with them. So in this way, it makes sense that he's also a potter, that he began his artistic career as a potter, somebody that works with clay. He takes dirt, a material often overlooked and devalued, and he transforms it into works of art, into pottery. So he takes objects that are overlooked, buildings that are overlooked, and neighborhoods that are overlooked, and he transforms them through a combination of attention, imagination, collaboration, and labor. Whether that's a clay pot or an entire neighborhood, it's the same kind of artistic project. Part of Theaster Gates' work that struck me throughout the research on this one is the sort of postmodernism of it. Like, I engage with a lot of artwork that draws attention to the relationship of symbols to the world, the relationship between the signifier and the signified and all that. And often, I'm left thinking about the hollowness of language and symbols, or the dangers of accepting the language and symbols of the past without critically thinking about their origins and connotations. But the work of Theaster Gates accepts the power of symbols, and then goes to work constructing new symbols with intention. Like, once we've established the ways in which symbols work, then we can get to work making better symbols. Tar will never just be tar for Theaster Gates, and he engages with it intentionally as a sort of religious practice to connect with his father. The construction of material objects is not superficial, it's not ironic. The construction of a tar painting is a way for him to actually strengthen his relationships in the real world. The material artifact doesn't put symbolic distance between him and the world, but the labor itself serves as a platform for a deeper, closer, and more sincere connection to people and places. And I think that's where I'll leave this one. I actually had another ending for this video where I talk about the Great Gatsby and symbol construction in relationship to Gates's work, but I think it got a little bit too detailed, so I've made that available on my Patreon for supporters, and you can check that out if you feel inspired to. Thank you for watching.